So we're glad to have everyone. We're back. We've got those who are with Facebook Live with us. So we're watching. We have kind of a hybrid experience in the space here, and it's a great opportunity for those who, I know some of you are coming to the late service, so you're here early, so you get to hear content here, and then you get to hear the sermon that goes with this afterwards. Those who were here in the earlier service, you got to hear Gaston preach. But the Reverend Gaston Warner is with Zoe Empowers, and he is here presenting and just information about what Zoe Empowers is really about. And we have, this will be recorded for people to be able to see, so we'll be able to tell what is, share this with people down the road and be able to use this. So Gaston is, everything that he has brought to this experience is so powerful. And the sermon said so much about the why, and now we get to hear the what, a lot of the how this happens. And so I shared this in my introduction of him. We'll share it again. But a good friend of mine, very good friends that I've known for years and years, that I used to be in ministry with, worked as part of my team when I was near Waco, are connected with Zoe and and I don't even think she knows you're here today. But I texted with Dawn some time ago, and Don Gilliland, a good friend of mine, has the one who said, you got to find out about this. You got to hear about what this is, because this is really important work. So without further ado, I want to introduce Gaston Warner. Gaston.
All right. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. So I'm so grateful to you all for caring about orphan children and vulnerable youth a half a world away. That's a big deal to care about. And so what I'd like to do is, I'm a Methodist pastor, so I can talk till you die, but I'd rather kind of give you just enough information to see what Zoe actually is, and a very different kind of approach that it takes, and then see if we have questions that we can kind of drive the conversation with, because that'll probably be more interesting. But I remember I was introduced to Zoe in 2000 and late 2006. And my job then was at Duke University, and I worked through Duke University Chapel, and my job for the university was to come alongside nonprofits and help them navigate relationships with the university. I'd work with about 60 or 65 nonprofits a year, helping them with synergy and strategy and all the kind of outward facing to the university. And I loved that work, and I met these incredible people doing amazing work, some of it locally, some of it regionally, some of it international. But I was also a little, not jaded, certainly not jaded, but circumspect in the tangible, measurable outcomes of all that work. And there's all these generous donors standing behind them, all these incredible people, but it was kind of like pinning down a watermelon seed to see exactly what had been accomplished. And so I had a friend of mine who was a Methodist pastor in Florida, and she said, Gaston, I want you to come on a board of this organization. Because I sat on some boards in that capacity, and I said, well, Janet, what do they do? And she said, well, it's this organization that discovered this model for empowering orphan children and vulnerable youth living in Africa. At that time, it was only Africa, in a way where they moved from life-threatening poverty to sustainable self-sufficiency across every area of life, wrapped in layers of community and knowing they're not beyond the love of God in Christ. And I distinctly remember thinking, wow, that's really unlikely. I wasn't an expert in the field, but I knew these young people had everything going against them, and I thought Janet had just been sold. I mean, she's really intelligent, she knows her stuff, she'd lived in Africa, but I thought someone sold her a bill of goods. But I loved my friend, and I feared her slightly, and so I came on the board. And I was amazed not only by what they were doing, but how they were accomplishing it. So this is kind of how Zoe started, and then we can see if we can dig into questions. Zoe was a relief ministry out of the North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church for orphans left in the wake of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. and we bounced along quite happily doing that work. I'll say some of this in the sermon as well. We had an overage of funding. We wanted to invest it. We put out word that we were looking for someone who had something that was really moving the needle, addressing the root causes of poverty. And we were introduced to this Rwandan social worker named Epiphany Mujawamana. And Epiphany had grown up as a vulnerable child. She had gotten her family through that situation. On the other side of that, the Rwandan genocide hit in '94. And there were 800,000 single or double orphans created in 100 days in her country. And so she decided to dedicate her life to helping these young people. She went to work for these large Western aid organizations, names you'd instantly recognize, and she became disillusioned with the work. And what she said is there was a cycle of relief and dependency on that relief, and there was no way for these young people to get out of that cycle. And so Epiphany and a team of other Rwandan social workers, frustrated by that cycle, went directly to the villages. They talked to the leaders and pastors and all the important people, but more importantly, they talked to the orphan children. And these orphan children usually weren't single. Sometimes you had a single street child, but usually you had a sibling group. So you'd have like an 18-year-old young woman with a 16-year-old brother and a 12-year-old sister, and maybe because of the vulnerability, an infant in the picture. And that would be a youth-headed household. And so what Epiphany did is over time, they worked out the pieces that they would need to stand on their own feet. Because when I had engaged in work with extremely vulnerable populations, the question, especially children, the thing I'd ask is, what can I do to help these poor children? Epiphany came with a different question. She said, there's these desperately poor, financially poor young people, but they have God-given gifts and God-given skills, and they have abilities, and there's things that they can do. What would they need in their life to be surrounded with in order to stand on their own feet and never need charity again? And so with that very different question, she started working directly with the village leadership, for whom these children are an enormous problem because they're sick and they're dirty and they're begging for food or begging for work and working for food. And so they're seen as kind of a pariah, a difficulty in the village. And so what she did is she first talked to the leadership about changing that dynamic. The leaders would stand behind it. She would gather these orphan children into empowerment groups of 60 to 100 total young people, but inside that 60 to 100, there'd be 25 of these youth-headed households. So each youth-headed household was led by a youngest person who was at least 12 years of age. Usually 14's a little better, along with their younger siblings, on up to 20 years of age, along with their younger siblings. So a big age range in the group. The average age of the group was probably 10 or 11. The average age of the heads of households is probably 17, 18. And what she would do then is over the next 3 years, that group would elect leadership and make their own decisions. And Zoe and the local community leaders and churches like Wellspring would stand behind that group, supporting them with the access to the small trainings and resources that they would need in order to become sustainably self-sufficient. And what they would do, they would become food secure. They would be able to have safe, secure housing that sometimes they rented at first, and then they saved enough money to buy land and bought materials, and then their group would help them build a house. They learned about health and hygiene so they're not getting sick in the first place, and access to health care. They would be able to kind of set their sights further for kind of skilled for long-term success with formal education or vocational training. They're able to start businesses, individual businesses and group businesses. And then they were able to be wrapped in layers of community. Their own empowerment group, their own biological families or the families that they created, their empowerment group, but also the village leadership standing behind them, and the larger community. We were able to do some family integration. And then Zoe's a Christian organization, so they saw and heard the very best of the gospel in ways that were never coercive. Anyone was welcome to participate fully in the program regardless of their beliefs, but they also saw and heard the gospel in ways that were really powerful without ever feeling like they had to say a certain thing in order to be part of the group. And the results of that blew me away. I'd never seen anything like it. There's about a 95 to 97% success rate. And success being after 3 years, They're sustainably self-sufficient, and they don't need any intervention anymore. Now, the groups stay together after 3 years. You can go back a decade later, and the group's still meeting together because they lean on each other. They're an extended family. But the interventions are no longer needed after a while. I'd never seen anything that had the power to produce that kind of thing. And then the best part, these young people, as soon as their lives start to stabilize, we see them start adopting other orphans. Say there's an 8-year-old who's a single orphan and doesn't have an older sibling and so couldn't participate. They'll adopt that 8-year-old into one of the families and care for them. They started employing other orphans. They started training other orphans. They started reaching out to widows and other vulnerable people in their villages and their communities. They went from being beggars and thieves to bosses and employers and leaders in their community. And now we're in 7 countries, 6 in Africa and also in India. We're about to add an 8th in Mozambique. And there's over 160,000, including graduates, that have gone through the program. And we're just at the very beginning of what God might do with the program, because it is scalable and replicable in ways that blow my mind. We have 1 staff per 1,000 orphans, because the orphans are doing all the work. And all they need is a little nudge onto the track, and they take off. So, and there's lots of volunteers as well that are from the local community. But it's kind of a powerful piece. All right, that was a lot of talking. So why don't I pause and see if you have any questions? And if you have no questions, you're going to be forced to hear me again. Oh, great, good.
I might be wrong in the name of this, but there's an African concept called
Ubuntu.
which, as I understand it, is quite different from the American understanding of the relationship of the individual to society. In Ubuntu, it's truly one where my welfare is connected to your welfare, is connected to everybody else's
Yeah.
welfare, so they don't have this emphasis that we have in America on individual rights, individual liberty, but lifting yourself out of your bootstraps.
Yeah.
It's a more friendly communal approach. Does that affect the success of the program? Is that in the area? Is that wild American speculation or misunderstanding?
Not at all. So there's this African concept of Ubuntu, where it's a very communal kind of approach, whereas in America and other wealthy Western countries where there's a lot more individualism. And there's advantages and disadvantages there. I mean, some of what people see as corruption among African leaders is because there's a sense of about 70 or 80 people that they're responsible for, and so kind of giving a job here and there is seen as a responsibility and not necessarily as a negative. And so there are some cultural kind of nuances that come into play there. But I would also offer that people that live in extreme poverty tend to see other people as opportunity. We need each other in order to survive. Whereas on the other side, once we start becoming wealthy, we see other people as threats. We have to have an alarm system. We have to lock our doors. We have to make sure that no one takes advantage of us. So we have stuff to lose. These kids have nothing to lose. And so they're able to meet with others in a way that's kind of powerful, because these kids fall below Ubuntu. They are seen as a problem in the village. And it's not that people are hard-hearted, it's just that no one has very much. And these kids are constantly begging and sometimes stealing. And so it becomes a real, they usually feel completely isolated. And the group reintroduces that feeling of belonging as a peer among peers. Does that make sense? I mean, it's, I think it's a powerful kind of concept. Other questions? No pressure, one at a time. Yep, okay.
Is there any relationship between this and the Methodist Church?
So the question is there any relationship between this and the Methodist Church? And there is and there isn't. I mean, it's kind of it's been a funny, a productive, generative relationship. So Zoe started in 2004 when a 15-year-old young woman in a United Methodist Church in North Carolina felt this call. She felt called to go to Africa to minister with AIDS orphans. So as a 15-year-old, she came home and told her parents, about this calling. And they, as very supportive parents, said, "Oh no, you're not going to Africa to do this." but she felt called and she kept at them. And finally, they went to their pastor and said, "Pastor, she thinks she's called to go to Africa this summer to care for AIDS orphans. You got to talk her out of it." He said, "Okay, I'll do what I can." So he met with her and prayed with her and met with her and prayed with her and then wished her well as she went off to Africa. And she wrote about that experience, and it got her church excited, and they got their district excited, who got their conference excited. And in 2004, Zoe was launched as a ministry of the North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. But it didn't get any funding from the church. So the church said, "Hey, and if you ever want to start an organization where you don't have to follow all the bureaucracy, just don't take any money." So Zoe was able to kind of operate as this separate entity that gave it a lot of flexibility. But it had the blessing of the United Methodist Church and its GBGM Advanced Special and all that. Over time, we've kind of become a more ecumenical ministry. And the United Methodist Church likes to start ministries and spin them off, like the Methodist Home for Children and the Methodist Retirement Homes. They spin them, it's a liability thing. And so they like to spin them off, so we've been spun off. But still, most of our support comes from United Methodist churches. And so it's very Wesleyan in its approach, but we probably have 75 staff worldwide, and 4 of us are United Methodist. So it's a pretty small group, but yeah. So yes and no.
Gaston, I have a question I want to ask that I think can be really helpful. When you have funds that come in, tell us some of the pathways that the funds work. How is the funding helping with the ministry of Zoe?
So the way that Zoe works, because the young people are making their own decisions, child sponsorship programs are a little difficult because in a child sponsorship program, usually you kind of adopt a child, which is a funny concept in and of itself. And that child is usually picked out of a family, and they're usually the youngest child because they're the ones that can stay in it for the longest. And the theory is that if that child is pulled out of poverty, it'll pull the rest of the family out of poverty. But you can imagine there's some dynamics there. And it's also, it might be an 18-year run in the program. And it's hard to do empowerment in that way. What Zoe does instead is we have churches and individuals who stand behind empowerment groups. So an empowerment group this year, it goes up slightly next year. This year it's $8,500 a year for 3 years. For a full empowerment group of up to 100 young people, or you can do a half empowerment group, which is $4,250. That's the thing we have that's really our most robust piece, because then a church or an individual is assigned a specific group. And we can do virtual mission trips with that group. They can go over to Africa or India and see that group and meet with them. They get reports on the group. I mean, you can follow their progress. There's lots of other ways to give. We have VBS stuff with, there's a catalog where you can buy rabbits and all that stuff. So there's other ways to do it, but that's the one that's really that churches and individuals get a big kick out of. And it ends up being, last year, the average cost per child per month was $7.39. Because empowerment's less expensive. Because the goal of empowerment is not to provide all the needs, but to provide the minimum that is needed for the young people to succeed. Because the secret and the sauce is they have to feel like they have accomplished it with some support from behind. If you go in and someone's like, "Oh, this person fed me for 2 years," and then you're gone, it's hard to know what to do. But if you're like, "I fed myself for 2 years, I had some support to do that, and now I'm able to do it on my own." It's that kind of piece that we're trying to get to. It's a different way of thinking about ministry. And 1 staff per 1,000 orphans is, 10 years ago, people thought we were bonkers. But over the last 3 years, this crazy thing has happened where like USAID and some of these big funders are starting to describe the most effective approach in this kind of way, where the recipients are making their decisions. We had a fun thing. The president-elect of Kenya, who was just confirmed by the Supreme Court, he's been a Zoe supporter for years and has come to lots of our events and mentioned Zoe on the campaign trail. And so we're interested to see kind of what his vision is. It's always, getting in with politics is always interesting, but we're kind of hopeful that'll give us a platform to help more children. So.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. My text is, anyway. This is a question about longitude and length of times. I have in my mind times from 12, 15 years ago when children who were in my church then were living in poverty. And they're roughly at the same place today. Except it's 12 or 15 years later, which would mean like they're working at the Whataburger off and on or something like that.
Yep.
Imagine a child, 4, 6, something like that, going into Zoe 10 years ago. What would be the arc of their life in that 10 years? How would they get into the group? What would they learn? How would they graduate to leadership or not? That kind of question.
And this is a fun question for me. I'm a data nerd. I don't know how many of you are out there. I used to show slides on kind of graphs of the actual data tracking the specific accomplishments in different areas, and the staff made me promise to stop doing that. But we track the progress we track it very carefully during the first 3 years with a randomized sample size from all the mature programs. And so you can actually see the movement in food security, in housing, in health and hygiene, in education, in vocational training, in business development, in income generation, and community reintegration. So during the first 3 years of the program, we have a lot of robust data for that. We're currently involved in a study. There's a group called CAFO, Christian Alliance for Orphans, and they fund studies as well as other things. And so our models kind of come onto their radar, because most of what they do internationally is focused on orphanages. And there's about 140 million young people falling into this extreme poverty without kind of parents able to provide for them category. And 5 to 8 million of those are in orphanages, but about 98% of the church effort is on orphanages or foster care from the orphanages. And so they don't have a lot that focuses on the other 135,000. So they're commissioning research that's happening right now on graduates that have been out 3 and 5 years. And so we know what happens with those young people because we track them, and the groups don't dissipate. You can visit a group 10 years later because they're still staying together. So we're aware of what's going on, but this will be the first time we have systematic outside data on exactly what that is. But what we've seen is during the program, they have this kind of arc on success. And then after the program, it levels out a little bit, but it continues up. So if you visit someone who graduates in year 1, in year 5, they're at a better spot consistently. And we spot checked that and everything, but this will be our first systematic data set. Sorry.
Even the younger ones.
Especially the younger ones. So the eldest sibling, all the young people participate. So if you have that 18-year-old, say with a 16-year-old brother and a 12-year-old sister and say another 8-year-old sister, the 8-year-old fully participates in the program. She might raise rabbits because, they multiply like rabbits and evidently are delicious. So she'll have her business going on. And she'll hear about the child rights, but it'll be her eldest sister who's really the head of the household. But what happens is that eldest sister kind of sees herself as a parent of the 8-year-old. And the eldest sister's probably not going to go to college. We have a number of our young people that actually do qualify for college. They get a scholarship from their countries, but they have to be way up there. But that 8-year-old, the other older siblings might be earning enough money for that 8-year-old to go to school and finish her education completely. So my grandfather dropped out of school when he was 13 because he had to work on the farm. Both his boys got master's or doctorate degrees. And so there was a generational shift in that family that we have in our own country, but we've forgotten that sometimes that's what we're looking for with this program is a generational shift. Can I give any other long answers to perfectly simple questions?
So we have this question that, it's actually more of a blessing and a statement from Gretchen Gray. Reverend Gaston, I now know and understand actually what missions contribute to this world that God has created, to create a group bond of followers of Christ to help and redefine others, to know that God works in mysterious ways and He is here, there, and everywhere. There is power in His name. I will pray that each and every one will pray for the world, that the world would be a better place for you, me, and many, many more. Amen.
Amen.
So,
that's a pretty good blessing.
So that's a great blessing. That's Gretchen's gift.
Go Gretchen. Yeah,
blesses
absolutely.
us.
Thank you, Gretchen.
Yes.
That was fantastic.
Yeah, she does.
And it is amazing because it's the young people who are the missionaries in this scenario. The in-country Zoe staff stand behind them, and the community leaders and the volunteers stand behind them, but it's the young people who are the workers. They're the primary people in it. And that just changes everything in ways that are kind of mysterious, as Gretchen alludes to.
And I want to add one more piece to this is a question concerning. Is my mic on? A question concerning the connection. So back in around 2014, there were members of this church who were leaders in mission who studied Robert Lupton's toxic charity. And so Relief to Empowerment goes from, it really is like building on that. Now, not many people in this space, I don't know, is anybody here Ken was in the toxic charity study? So we've had enough attrition over time that we don't have the same, and some of the people are just not in this room right now. But I want to see how this ties. What you're doing very much ties with that notion. And so I want to ask, it's sort of two-point question.
Don't make it three, because my brain only holds two.
I know. How does this connect with Lupton's work?
Right.
One. Secondly, talk to us about what he called mission tourism and how that can be a thing, but you just name it. Right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's a couple stories about that. Bob Lupton is an incredible guy. He's a practitioner, and he's a practitioner mainly in the Atlanta area. And so a lot of his work is based kind of U.S.-based kind of work. So from Relief to Empowerment builds on Bob's work, certainly, but it's more in an international context. And if anything, Bob's work of empowerment's a little harder than it is in our international context. Because our young people are in life-threatening poverty. And so getting them to pay attention to the program is not a concern. They're in. I mean, their life depends on the success of this program. They're serious about it. They'll set up a fine structure. If someone doesn't come to the meeting, they'll fine them. They'll have a financial fine. And the only time we intervene is when we say, hey, that's a little stiff. Why don't you bring that down a little bit? Now, if someone has an excuse, they'll give an excuse, but they're pretty serious about it. If someone falls behind or someone is still, say, drinking alcohol or stealing in the program, because a lot of these kids are street children, a little wild before coming in the program, they'll love on them and they'll talk to them and they'll help them, and the group will show up at their house and help them with businesses. And if they refuse to fly straight, they'll kick them out of the group. But they won't let anyone fail who's trying. And often someone who's kicked out of the group kind of rejoins later or rejoins another group later on. So it ties in really well with Bob's work, but in a slightly different context. Toxic Charity, When Helping Hurts, there was kind of a slew of these books that kind of laid a foundation that's now been built upon. And then the second part, I said I had a two-part mind, but I have a one-part mind, evidently.
It's tourism.
Yeah, he called missional tourism. We call it misery tourism, where people go and look at the poor people and ride in a bus, looking out at the poverty. Obviously, that's demoralizing, and it's really demoralizing both for the recipients of that attention, but also for the ones doing kind of the misery. But at the same time, there's something powerful in seeing something you haven't seen. And often if you see extreme poverty, it opens your eyes to seeing poverty in your own community. So I think it's a complex picture. Zoe, again, has an advantage because the young people are in charge of the program. So when you come on a Zoe trip, and I want you to come on a Zoe trip. Right now we've got a trip in Tanzania, a trip in Kenya, and a trip in Rwanda. And I'm leaving next week on a trip to Malawi. So we've got trips going all the time. You can just sign up and come on. It's great. But when you go on a Zoe trip, what happens is they take us out to see these young people. And if someone's on the trip who's partnering with a group, we go and see that group. And the young people have done their own presentation. So they'll usually stand up and talk about, brag about what God's done in their life and their businesses and how their siblings are doing. And then we'll have a time to worship together and ask questions of each other. And they'll ask you questions and you'll ask them questions. But there's no money involved in that side of it because the groups that are partnered already are completely committed to all the way through the program. So they're not trying to hit you up for anything. They're just sharing with you what God's done in their life. And it actually allows space for something approaching a real relationship. Because it's hard to have relationships with differential power structures that just really, it's possible, but only through miracles. But when that power structure is a little bit less, it really can change things. And it changes the perception of the building, of the community members of these young people, especially in the first year, because they see these as kind of the pariah of the community, the beggars and the thieves. And when these VIPs roll into town and spend 2 hours with these young people, it changes the way the community views it. So it has some tangible effects. But yeah, misery tourism is real, but there's ways to flip it on its head. And I'll kind of give one just really quick example. So in Zoe's program, the kids do all this stuff, and we support them, but it's not like we're going over to train them how to do things. There's indigenous staff, there's local people who do that. But we had one large Methodist church, and they had a large women's group. And they wanted to go over, it was in Malawi, and they wanted to go over and they wanted to train the young people on how to make mats. And we said, well, that's not really in our model. They're learning stuff, but they choose their own businesses and all that. But we have to do this or we can't support it. And I said, why do you have to do it? They said, we find if we do an activity together, it builds relationships. And I said, okay, we can do that. And so they went over, and some of the crafts people in this group taught the women's group how to make baskets. And so there's ways, in really little ways, that you can just kind of flip over things, and it changes it from misery tourism to cross-cultural awareness. And it's really, and it builds the young people up.
Right. Do you ever have a situation where the support groups back in the States get feedback from the empowerment groups that they don't like how that group has chosen to raise themselves up? Maybe it's harmful to the other groups, or they just, and they meter their support or cut off their support as a result of that?
Right, so the question is, do we ever, and tell me if I'm getting this right, do we ever get feedback from our kind of donor support base that they don't like something that's going on in the program and kind of withdraw their support? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Yep.
They don't like how the group has chosen to raise themselves up, and they think it could be harmful.
Yeah, we haven't experienced much of that. Not that we couldn't, but we're pretty brutal with our donors. So when our donors come in, they kind of know from the ground floor that they can't intervene in the decision making of the young people. Now, if someone's going to do something illegal, we'll talk about that. And certainly the staff and the young people will talk. Like we had a 3-year discussion in Malawi, could they grow tobacco? Because tobacco is a big cash crop, but Methodists frown on tobacco. And so, we had a little bit of a quandary. We didn't want to cut them off from a really viable income source, but, we don't want to kill people either. But they talked through it. And most of the countries, the young people in the group decided to not do tobacco, but a couple of the countries decided to do tobacco. Now, with our donors, we're pretty strict. So if you go over on a Zoe trip, you can't give away anything. If you drink a bottle of water, you can't give away the empty bottle. If we catch you handing a dollar bill to somebody, we'll have a serious discussion about putting you on a plane back. Because these young people were beggars, and they pulled themselves out of that, and why put them back in that position? So we're pretty strict on our thing. If someone offered us $10 million, but we had to do X, Y, or Z, for us it would be an easy decision to refuse that, because the program is kind of primary. Now, we'd try to negotiate first, but at the end of the day, if it was something that was going to hurt the program, we'd refuse it, just because the program is the thing that's so valuable. And it works. And it works in a space where so few things actually work. Does that get to your question? I don't know if okay.
When you see this being so successful in these other countries, can you see how these principles could work in the U.S.?
This is a question I get a lot. So the question is, so successful in Africa and India, would it also work here? The foundation of it would. We tried it in Guatemala with young people that were, say, in generational poverty, but not in the same level as in Africa and India. They were malnourished, but they weren't starving. And it worked, but not nearly as transformationally as it did in Africa and India. So it would need to be tweaked. But Zoe is similar to a certain very successful social institution in the U.S. that has everything against it, and it's gangs. So gangs are a group of young people that come together for mutual protection and respect. You have drug dealers that kind of insert money into that, and the thought is that they'll get some economic resources out of it. It's all lies. It's all based on, it's run by Satan, but there's a reason why young people join up with that. And the same reason that they join up with a gang is what they get out of a Zoe group, that support, that protection, that economic possibility, that hope. Only it's based on Jesus, and so it actually comes true. So I think it would work if we had a group that could really make it sing. And I've talked with foster care programs, with young people aging out of the foster care system, which is a hard time. I think it would work there. I think it would work in some of our Native American areas. I think it would work really well in some of those situations as well. So I've had a couple discussions here and there where I usually have 10 or 12 of those discussions a year, and it hasn't caught on yet, but someday it will.
Well, we're going to have to call our time here, because we do have another service that'll be starting, and we have a band that would like to be warmed up. So
Sorry.
Thank you very much, Gaston, for your time, for sharing with us. And he'll be around before the next service to have conversation. We can be out in the Munch and Mingle area. But thanks to those who joined on live stream and who have been part of this with us through this whole time. And it'll be also, as I said, available. This conversation will be out there on our YouTube channel, on Facebook for the world to see. So thank y'all very much. And with that, we're going to be dismissed here.
Thank you.